In preparing today's video, we reached out to EVgo's press team for an official statement, as well as a couple of EVgo contacts we happen to have for clarification on the new policies discussed in this video. As of the time of filming, we have not heard back. If we do in the future, we'll make a note below. Just like petrol and diesel-powered cars rely on petrol stations to provide them with the fuel they need to operate, and similarly, hydrogen fuel cell electric cars rely on compressed hydrogen fuel dispensers to replenish their fuel tanks, so too do battery electric vehicles rely on charging stations to keep their battery packs charged up and ready for adventure. If you own a solar-powered car, that is different, but since not a single solar-powered car is currently available right now, well, it's a moot point. Anyway, if you are one of the lucky folks who has access to off-street parking and you have a charging spot outside your home, a nearby outlet, or perhaps even a dedicated charging station, the chances are that for at least 95% of your daily driving duties, you don't actually need to charge away from home. After all, most modern electric vehicles can travel at least 60 miles, 100 kilometers per charge, far less than the mean daily commute for most people around the world. And most, although not all electric models made in the last few years can do double that range without ever needing to stop to refuel. If you fit in that category, you probably only use public charging when you are on a long-distance trip, or you've just happened across some free-to-use charging and have decided to take advantage of the opportunity. But if you are someone who owns a shorter-range electric car, which still of course exists, or you happen to not have access to a charging station at home or somewhere to park to charge, or indeed you happen to own a DIY converted car, either one you've converted yourself from an internal combustion engine vehicle or happen to have purchased in that format from someone else, the chances are that you will need to plug in more frequently when you're out and about. So imagine if you found out that your local charging network had decided to ban your car, or in fact a swathe of vehicles, from using the network. What would you do then? Well, that is exactly what's happening here in the US. Over the weekend, charging provider EVgo sent a message to all of its customers informing them that as of today, yes, it literally gave a few days' notice, it was changing its terms and conditions of use to explicitly prohibit the use of unapproved charging station adapters on its network, as well as banning access to any DIY converted or modified electric vehicle. Anyone caught violating the terms and conditions will presumably get banned from the network. On this channel, we support the use of all kinds of cleaner, greener, safer and smarter vehicles, both ones that are made by mainstream car companies as well as those that are made and converted by a generally strong and knowledgeable community of DIY enthusiasts and specialists. So today we're going to try and get to the bottom of this, discuss why the change of terms and conditions might be happening, explain both sides of the equation as best we can, and ask if there's a smart move to keep the network and customers safe, or if this is a slippery slope that will ultimately end in EVs being banned from charging networks. First, let's look at the terms and conditions. Here's a copy of the letter I received as an EVgo customer over the weekend. It states, quote, "For your safety, EVgo only permits the use of automaker-manufactured charging adapters on the EVgo charging station or with EVgo's charging network. EVgo prohibits the use of all other adapters on EVgo's network and charging stations." Further down, it says, quote, "Similarly, EVgo prohibits the use of all home-built electric vehicles, home-built onboard chargers, and vehicles that contain personally modified chargers." But what is meant by authorized adapters? In this case, I think it's fair to say that this is pretty much exclusively for the benefit of Tesla customers, because I honestly cannot find another automaker which requires a rapid charging adapter in order to use EVgo's networks, which usually have both CCS and CHAdeMO charging plugs at each station. Since EVgo just announced an expansion to its program of adding Tesla CHAdeMO adapters to more of its charging network, opening up more of that network to Tesla customers, which would presumably reduce pressure on heavily used parts of the supercharger network, this doesn't seem coincidentally timed. In adding Tesla CHAdeMO adapters to its stations, those adapters are essentially locked but have enough slack in them to allow Tesla owners to plug their vehicles in, EVgo should be eliminating the need for Tesla customers to lug around their own CHAdeMO adapter. And I'm guessing that banning non-Tesla sanctioned charging adapters does seem like a smart move from a liability point of view. After all, if you're putting 50 or more kilowatts of DC quick charging power through a badly made connector, bad things would happen. But here's the thing. I'd understand the policy if CHAdeMO adapters that were poorly constructed was commonplace, but they're not. In fact, I spent a fair amount of time over the weekend looking for them, and I couldn't find any. The only Tesla CHAdeMO adapters I can find were official Tesla ones, which you can buy for about $400. In this case then, the wording about third-party adapters suggests that it is a catch-all, save-our-butts move by EVgo, just in case this ever becomes a problem in the future. And in its official long-form on-website T's and C's, it is even clearer that we're talking about Teslas here. Tesla AC adapters for use with EVgo AC chargers, Tesla authorized or manufactured CHAdeMO adapters for DC quick charging, and any other, quote, automaker manufactured adapter are listed as being acceptable. This doesn't seem coincidental that these terms and conditions are changing now, just as EVgo is expanding its Tesla charging adapter program. After all, we know how Tesla feels about modified and DIY fixed cars, to the point that it's banned any salvaged Teslas from its network. Could this step by EVgo amount to the same ban for modified and salvaged Teslas that aren't welcome on the supercharger network, but to this point have somehow managed to get around regular DC quick charging? Yes, I think so. So what about the modified EV and home-built EVs then? Well, again, I think this is the start of something rather unsavoury. My good friend and former editor John Volker and I chatted about these new T's and C's over the weekend, and as he reminded me, as someone who says he'd like to convert a car to electric himself at some point in the future, DIY conversions are unlikely to ever move out of a niche territory. He told me, quote, 17 million new and 40 million used vehicles are sold each year in the US. Conversions will only ever be a tiny drop in the bucket. And he's right. Conversions are a tiny part of the EV community today. After all, unless you are an avid car person whose circle of friends are all avid gearheads, the chances are that today, most people that you know wouldn't dream of working on their own car, be it electric or internal combustion. Be honest, how many people do you know who would happily do an engine swap over the weekend? How many would swap out the clutch when it breaks and know how to? And how many of them would just take it to the dealership instead? It is unfortunate for sure, but the reality is that the overwhelming majority of car owners today don't want to or don't know how to work on their cars. It might be true that everyone who works at Transport Evolved to this point has turned a wrench and is okay doing so. Kate, myself, and Erin have all worked on our cars, and Morgan is studying engineering. But we are not representative of the general population. Despite this acknowledgement, however, I do feel it's important to notice a few things. First, the entire nomenclature of handmade vehicles, homemade chargers, and personally modified chargers is a little bit vague. Homemade implies non-professional installations, but I suspect what's meant by this is any vehicle not made by a major OEM or any equipment not made by a major OEM. But where does that stop? For example, there is the CHAdeMO adapter from Quick Charge Power in San Diego. It's designed an aftermarket CHAdeMO installation package for owners of the original Tesla Roadster, second-generation Toyota RAV4 EV, and Mercedes-Benz B-Class electric drive, all three of which have Tesla-made power electronics, but none were made with rapid charging from the factory. CHAdeMO allows them all to rapid charge using a CHAdeMO station. Quick Charge Power is well known among owners of these three vehicles, and it most certainly isn't a backyard conversion, yet it's limited in its scope and market reach. I'd wager that it would be prohibited under these terms. And what about the open source inverter community who are using OEM parts from production electric and hybrid vehicles and then repurposing them to give life to ICE vehicles converted to electric? In this case, I would suggest that they are most definitely the target of these changed T's and C's, but unless there has been an incident that I'm not aware of involving a DIY converted or tweaked EV, I haven't been aware of any problems at a charging station. And in order to do an EV conversion, you need to have at least a basic understanding of electronics. Moreover, if you're going to use a rapid charging network to charge a DIY EV, CHAdeMO is currently the more commonly used protocol, it's not simply a case of plugging in and letting power flow, because just like lower powered charging protocols, there are safeties in place to prevent power from being provided at the connector's various pins until it is inserted into a vehicle and the correct handshakes have been made. To do that, you have to understand how to work with the various communication protocols required for DC quick charging. Unless, of course, you're blindly using something off the shelf, like a part you purchased from a company that usually deals with prototypes from major OEMs, you're going to have some understanding. Most, but not all, DIY folks have some sort of engineering know-how. Granted, not all are hardware or software engineers during the day, but even those using off-the-shelf parts with a less than ideal knowledge base have a vested interest in their own personal project vehicle not going bang. Edge cases can and will occur. The rate of incidence of those happening, though, is going to be a very small percentage of a very small percentage of people with DIY EVs. And sure, there's a possibility that any electric car of any sort could catch fire while charging, whether it was made by an OEM or by a guy in his shed. The ban also appears to apply to AC charging stations too, meaning that if you want a lower powered charging experience and happen to have a DIY converted EV, you are out of luck. And if you have an old EV like the original Toyota RAV4 EV that I had, one that perhaps needs a J1772 adapter in order to let you use your old portable paddle charger with a modern charging station, forget it. From a liability standpoint, I can certainly understand that EVgo and charging networks like it are looking to protect themselves from liability claims. But at the end of the day, I think it would have been perfectly acceptable to have simply noted in the terms and conditions that any non-OEM vehicle plugged in would be liable for any damages that occurred to the station as a consequence of its use, and that the owner would not go after the charging provider. But actively banning a group of vehicles because they're not from a recognised automaker or have been modified in some ways, that's not good. With my cynical hat on, it feels like maybe, just maybe, EVgo and other charging networks are gearing up to ban anything but OEM vehicles from their networks as part of some protectionist move. Which leaves us where? Ultimately, we could see a future where DIY conversions are not allowed, not because they're not safe, but because special interest groups have sought to outlaw them. And that is already happening in some countries around the world. Take Slovakia, for example, where anyone converting a car to electric has to get approval from the original automaker before the Slovak government agencies will approve the conversion. There aren't many conversions in Slovakia. I'd argue that with restrictions on who can use charging stations, we'll ultimately see conversions killed off, and that will affect a small percentage of EV drivers. As my friend John said, conversions are and will continue to be a very small percentage of the overall electric fleet. But you know what might have a larger market share? People with replaced batteries. With Nissan, for example, making the replacement cost of batteries for its early Leaf uneconomical, many Leaf owners are looking to third-party or DIY options, sourcing batteries from lower mileage cars to replace their vehicles' worn out and prematurely aged packs. Some owners are doing the swaps themselves, and others are looking to cottage industry specialists. Under these sweeping terms and conditions from EVgo, I would argue that those cars would similarly be banned too, especially anyone who replaced their Leaf's original battery pack with a larger capacity one from a later model year, one that maybe required a CAN bus modification or a custom BMS to function. And that could, ultimately lead to cars being scrapped early, older model EVs being rendered obsolete, and automakers and charging networks being gatekeepers for affordable EVs, keeping them out of the market. I don't like it one bit. After all, if every modified or tweaked car was prevented from buying gasoline, the roads would be a lot less busy. That's it for today. As always, thanks to the folks on my right for being our $15 to $49 a month Patreon supporters. Special thanks to our $50 a month Patreons. That's John Lyons, Raging Fellows, Anonymous Freak, Paul Conway, Laura Sanborn, Anthony Coates, and Tuzla in the Gong. And our deepest gratitude to our $100 a month Patreon supporters: Marcel Ward, Jeffrey Songster, Reggie Watts, JP Fagerback, Sean Ueda, Will Graylin, and Ian. You can join all of these amazing Patreon supporters by following the links below. You'll also find a link to send us a tip through Ko-fi or Bitcoin if you would prefer to support us that way. You'll also find a link to our Discord chat room, which is completely free to join, so give it a go if you are feeling chatty. And as usual, you'll find everything from t-shirts to face masks and water bottles at our Redbubble store. Thanks for joining me, and as always, keep evolving.